and I quote, were not entitled to the same levels of shelter and subsistence, unquote. The earlier prisoners were supposedly covered by the Geneva and Hague Conventions, but who equivocates about dates when it is time to decide who is going to eat and who is going to starve? The Soviets had not signed any agreements regarding humanitarian treatment of prisoners of war. Therefore, they were not obligated to treat their prisoners humanely. The Allies intended to use the Germans as slave labor, also according to the Morgenthau Plan, and as discussed in Moscow in 1943 and at Yalta. On April 17, 1945, the U.S. opened Camp Rheinberg on the Rhine, about 6 miles wide in circumference. This was just one of several Rhine meadow camps, actually just enclosures. Many opened in mid-April. Like the others, this one had no food, no buildings, no tents, no cooking facilities, no water, and no latrines, typical of the U.S. camps in Germany. Camp conditions caused rampant disease among the German prisoners who suffered from exposure, overcrowding, and malnutrition. On April 21, 1945, Eisenhower sent another message to General Marshall, reporting that the new prisoner enclosures, and I quote, will provide no shelter or other comforts, unquote. The prisoners would be obligated to improve the enclosures with any available materials. However, there were no available materials. A later order prohibited the prisoners from erecting any kind of shelter at all. German prisoners often sought shelter by digging holes in the mud. The enclosures consisted of open fields surrounded by barbed wire known as prisoner of war temporary enclosures, complete with searchlights, guard towers, and men with machine guns. By the summer of 1945, the British and the U.S. had more than 6 million troops in their barbed wire enclosures. The Soviets had over 2 million. The open-air enclosures lacked even the barest facilities found in Nazi camps, which usually had kitchens, infirmaries, hospitals, latrines, and barracks. Auschwitz had 2-story heated brick barracks with flush toilets. With no latrines, crowded, anxious inmates, standing almost shoulder to shoulder by necessity, often relieved themselves where they stood, which created a growing quagmire of contaminated, putrid mud. Latrines, actually ditches, where available, were abominable, perilous death traps for those who slipped. Food, water, and shelter, basic human necessities, were unavailable in the camps, per Eisenhower's orders. Although sufficient food resources, tents, blankets, were available in the Army's supply depots. On April 22, 1945, the U.S. had in Europe 50 days worth of 4,000-calorie rations to feed 5 million people and other lower-calorie rations for an additional 50 days. They had the food. They just chose not to give it. Author James Bach wrote, and I quote, "In April 1945, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, as well as the sick from hospitals, amputees, women's auxiliaries, and civilians were caught. One inmate at Rheinberg was over 80 years old. Another was aged 9. Nagging hunger and agonizing thirst were their companions, and they died of dysentery. A cruel heaven pelted them week after week with streams of rain. Amputees slithered like amphibians toward the mud, soaking and freezing, naked to the skies day and night, and day after day, night after night. They lay desperate in the sand of Rheinberg, or slept exhaustedly into eternity in their collapsing holes," unquote. George Weiss, a survivor, reported that the absence of water was the worst thing of all. And he said, and I quote, "For 3.5 days we had no water at all. We would drink our own urine. It tasted terrible, but what could we do?" Unquote. The U.S. military would not allow the International Committee of the Red Cross to come within the barbed wire enclosures as permitted by the Geneva Conventions. The U.S. military, per Eisenhower's instructions, did not allow prisoners to receive mail or packages. On April 26, 1945, the combined chiefs of staff in Washington cabled Eisenhower their approval of the disarmed enemy forces status for all German citizens, only in U.S. captivity. Everybody was considered an enemy.